How are you? I'm good. Front row. I like people who sit in the front row. That's good.
Yeah. Good stuff. For sure.
I had a professor in college who, on the first day of class, nobody sat in the front.
Right.
So he just removed all the chairs.
Well, we've had that conversation. Good morning. Good morning. That's a little echoey. Good morning. Welcome to those of you who are in the room, those of you who are joining us via live stream. I'm Catherine Bush, Associate Rector for Formation and Education here, and I'm glad to be welcoming you all into this continued conversation. That was, wow, I don't know where that came from. And for those of you who are in the room, just an acknowledgement of our continued improvements and progress as we watch these rooms come to life around us. And a reminder that we know the lights are not on, but they're a different electrical system, and the space is changing underneath our feet, but it's all to the good and so exciting. So we give thanks for that good progress. I'm going to open us with a prayer and then a word of introduction. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, guide the people of this land and of all the nations in the ways of justice and peace, that we may honor one another and serve the common good. And guide our nation during this election year, that we will value and uphold the common bond we share as citizens, and empower us to be graceful, loving, and brave. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Some of the intercessions that we're offering in this, prayers of the people in this season. I'm so thrilled to welcome back to Calvary David Waters, friend of Calvary and friend of mine. I'm honored to say David is part of the leadership team at the Institute for Public Service Reporting. Those of you who have been around Memphis for a while, though, know him as the voice, our conscience in the Commercial Appeal, where he was religion editor, among other roles, before he little stint up in D.C., working for the Washington Post. But because he loves Memphis so much, he and his family are back here grounded and helping us tell the stories that matter the most. If you're not following the Institute for Public Service Reporting, I'm sure social media is going to come up at some point in today's conversation, but it's a really good place. It's a good thread to have in your social media. So we're really honored to have him here to share his wisdom as both a man of deep faith and a man who sees the world and reports it faithfully. So welcome back, David Waters. Thanks.
Thank you. That's psrmemphis.com, just so you know. It's a stupid name. I don't know why they named it the Institute for Public Service Reporting. It doesn't really roll off the tongue. But basically, we do journalism in Memphis. And it's all online. It's all free. And I think we have some of the finest journalists in Memphis. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you. So thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to be here again. I always feel like this is sort of a church home away from home for me. I know so many folks here and see so many friendly faces. When Catherine asked me to do this, I'm pretty sure of the timing. It was before President Biden bowed out. And when she first asked me, my first thought was, hell no. I do not want to think about politics and the presidential campaign. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to mostly ignore it. I think Michelle Obama put it best. I felt like I think many people, no matter on what side you're on, this sense of dread moving into the campaign season. So my initial reaction was I didn't really want to do it. But the more I thought about it, and the more I realized that this was going to be late September, early October, sometime in there, and I thought, I'm going to need to be around as many thoughtful people of faith as possible during that time. And so maybe we can do this as sort of a group therapy session. So my name is David, and I'm a recovering political junkie. Thanks. I'm also a recovering daily newsman, and that's sort of also what I want to talk to you about. I've talked to you about that sort of before, about 2 years ago, but I want to talk about something that I hope will help us all maybe better process all the news we're hearing and seeing this time of year. I know it's helped me. I want to start with something I wrote. It's not the entire column, but it's the beginning of it. People I know, respect, and love were heartbroken by the results of last week's election. Others were heartened. How can this be? Same country, same election, same results, and yet some believe it's the end of the world as we know it. Others believe it's a reboot of the world that ended 2 years ago. Will Rogers said it, the more you observe politics, the more you've got to admit that each party is worse than the other. And so it goes. Democrats are from Mercury, Republicans are from Pluto, or maybe it's the other way around. I think it depends on the position of the planets on the first Tuesday in November every other year. Our bipolarizing elections wouldn't be so bad if they weren't so important, and if they didn't reflect the reality of how badly divided we are on so many matters: abortion, gay marriage, gay rights, health care, education, immigration, taxes, war, cable news networks. This land is blue land, this land is red land. And then I quote Parker Palmer from this book. When all our talk about politics is either technical or strategic, to say nothing of partisan and polarizing, we loosen or sever the human connections on which empathy, accountability, and democracy itself depend. I read that book. That book came out in 2011, and it's still just as relevant, maybe even more relevant today. Has anybody read it? Tom Momberg is the one who told me about it, and we read it. Have you read it? I highly recommend it. I think there's a newer, updated edition of it. In fact, I did a study group at Idlewild Presbyterian around that book. My wife and I did with Tom and Eileen and some other folks. And I found it's one of the things I go to every election season just to be sort of reminded of what really matters and how connected we all really are. So when do you think I wrote the thing I just wrote that I read to you? Could have been any year, right? It was actually 2014, so it was 10 years ago that I wrote that. And as I said, I think it's unfortunately just as relevant, if not more so, today than it was 10 years ago. So what do we do with all that? And unfortunately, I think our division, our polarization, our demonization of the other, politically and otherwise, is a lot of that can be laid at the feet of the news media as we know it. In 1976, when I graduated from high school and voted for the first time, 72% of Americans trusted mass media to fairly report the news. Today, that number is 32%, which I think is really maybe a little high. Of course, everything has changed since the 70s. A third of the newspapers that were existing then no longer exist. 2/3 of daily newspaper reporters who were working then no longer are working now. And I don't mean just because they've retired and gotten older, but because those positions no longer exist. We've had the advent of 24/7 cable news, streaming, social media, the smartphone. When I was here in 2022, I talked about why I stopped watching the news. And I talked about how it presents a distorted reality, how it blurs information and opinion, how it polarizes, angers, discourages. 2.5 years later, I have not stopped reading the news, but I'm getting closer. I'm reading less and less of it. Maybe the problem is that I've been at this too long. I know how the sausage gets made. I've made it myself. The first presidential campaign I covered was 1992. Seems like the good old days. Clinton and Gore, two hometown boys almost, were running, so we were all over that campaign, the commercial appeal. They sent me to South Carolina to cover the primaries in 1992. So I spent about 3 days hanging out with the candidates. I was at a farm with Jesse Jackson. I was at a shirt factory with Tom Harkin. I spent some time on a yacht in Charleston Harbor with Pat Buchanan. Notice the different settings here. I spent time on a college campus with Paul Tsongas, and I spent time in a church with, Bill Clinton, because where else would Bill Clinton go? We were trying to figure out if anyone could challenge President Bush, who was incumbent, and Bill Clinton, who seemed like the front runner at the time. And of course, no one really did. It was a lot of fun. I was there about 2.5, 3 days. I really enjoyed it. What did I write? I don't remember what I wrote. I'm not sure it mattered, and I'm not sure it really enlightened anybody. And here's the problem. I was there for 2 or 3 days. I basically parachuted in to a place I'd never been and hung out with people I've never known, and really didn't spend a whole lot of time getting to know. I talked to about 20 people over the course of about 2 or 3 days. 20 people out of 2.5 million registered voters. What could I possibly have written that would enlighten anybody about South Carolina or voting in South Carolina or anything? And that's what I call parachute journalism. And unfortunately, there's just a whole lot of that going on. And there are a lot of reasons for it, and it's not really worth getting into. But what happens is, when you do stories like that, you start climbing the ladder of abstraction. You go from the very concrete to the very abstract because you don't have enough time or space or knowledge to really get into the concrete ground level stuff. So the ladder of abstraction in the news media world starts at the concrete with what has happened. Who won the South Carolina primary? Well, it hadn't happened yet, so I didn't know. Then you can talk about what is happening. And I was sort of plugging into what was happening. The candidates were there. They were campaigning, talking to folks. So that was a little less concrete, a little more abstract, but not too much. Then we have a tendency in the news media, because we want to seem like we're so smart, that we move up the ladder again to what will happen or won't happen. Now, 99.9% of the time, we have no idea what will happen or what won't happen, but we can make educated guesses. And then finally, when you get to the top of the ladder of abstraction, it's what might happen. And that's what I would say majority of campaign coverage is all about. What could happen? How could this go? And I want to give you some examples in a minute. So we go from basically news and information to explanation, which I think is important. And then we get into things like generalization, extrapolation, speculation, and prediction. And I think it's important for all of us to be aware of the differences and to be aware when we're reading news stories or watching them on TV, what are those journalists doing? Are they just giving you the news, straight information? Are they trying to explain the news? Or are they extrapolating? Are they predicting? Are they speculating? Are they engaging in conjecture, which means an opinion or conclusion formed on the basis of incomplete information? One of the best descriptions of journalism I've ever heard is that a journalist's job is to describe reality. So if you're in Israel or you're in Gaza as a journalist, your job is to describe what is happening there now. And when things are happening like Israel and Gaza, it's dangerous, but it's not that difficult because it's all around you. It's happening right in front of you. You can observe it. You can see it and hear it happening. The reality on the ground at a rally where somebody tried to shoot the president or the presidential candidate, you can describe that reality right there. Or the reality at a school that has just experienced a shooting. Reality at a football game, reality at a music concert. Those are the realities we can be at. We can embed ourselves in and describe. But what is the reality of an election? Well, the election itself, the reality is who's running, who drops out, who gets nominated and so forth, and then who wins. That's the ultimate reality of an election, who won. And we do a really good job of explaining that, of telling you what happens and explaining why that happened after the fact. But what is the reality of an election campaign, which is a long, drawn-out process, especially when you're talking about the presidential process, 2-3 years, and really it never ends. And you're talking about 50 states, and you're talking about tens of millions of potential voters. And so how do you deal with that reality? How can you report on that reality? Well, a lot of what happens is news organizations end up relying on polls. They take polls, they commission polls, they refer to polls as if polls are the reality at the moment. And in some small, and I would argue relatively insignificant ways, they are a snapshot of reality at that moment. But what they really are is a snapshot of the 1,000 people who answered their phone. How many of you answer your phone if you don't know who's calling? I don't. How many of you respond to emails you don't know who are from? Texts, not me. So these are people who decided to answer the phone or respond to the text and agree to be questioned about, their beliefs and their thoughts on the election. So it's, even if they try to make sure it's not skewed, it ends up being skewed, right? So, but this is the reality that a lot of news organizations are sort of relying on to help them explain the reality of the election campaign season. And I think that presents not only a challenge for journalists, but I think it distorts reality. Unfortunately, and this is more true than ever, we have to provide content because you all demand content. We all demand content. When you are looking at the news on your phone, you are scrolling. And if you go back to the New York Times or the Commercial Appeal or whatever news source you have, you probably go back several times a day. And you're looking for something new, something you haven't seen, something you haven't read or heard. And news organizations understand that and know that, and they know that they have to continue to provide new content. There has to be a continued rotation of content. And that requires, especially in an age when there are fewer and fewer journalists, Commercial Appeal used to have 200, now there are about 15. But they not only fill up the paper every day, which is smaller than it ever was, but they fill up the website every day, and there is a constant churn. So they're working faster and harder than ever with fewer people. So that automatically means you're not getting the depth of coverage you need. But we have to provide this content. We have to provide new content all the time because the smartphone that we all carry around is insatiable. And we have to provide content that is clickable because that's how news organizations now make money. Advertising doesn't work anymore, so you have to have subscriptions and clicks, ads based on clicks. So the more clicks, the more money you make. Hi, Bill. Good to see you. So I want to start by explaining the click situation to you from a very important news organization. Whoops, that's the abstract. That's the ladder of abstraction. You can see, and writers use this all the time. If you're a novelist or you're a nonfiction writer, you think about things like this, like how do you go from something as abstract as produce to something as, your grandmother's favorite apple? When you're more concrete, it just makes it a more vivid, interesting experience. Anybody read The Onion? Thank God for The Onion. So this was one of the headlines in The Onion not long ago. And I'll read just the beginning of the story. Back when it was great, respected, and a profitable business, journalism employed thousands of reporters who worked tirelessly to cover interesting and important stories from around the globe. But now, after years of neglect and over-reliance on programmatic advertising and predation by private equity firms, the industry is all but a desiccated husk of its former self, crawling toward death with nothing and no one but the Onion to save it. And then later on in the story, it says this: every single click through our bloated, ad-riddled website will help keep the entire industry on life support until a billionaire owner, private equity firm, or consulting group finally decides to pull the plug once and for all. And unfortunately, there's a lot of truth in that. So I think that's one of the biggest shifts I've seen from the time I went to the South Carolina primary in 1992 till now, is that we have this insatiable need for newer and newer content and a need for you to click on it. And so it's not enough just to provide news and information. There just isn't enough news and information out there to keep feeding it to you minute by minute. So we've had to find other ways to present news and information, and that is when we've climbed up the ladder of abstraction and we've moved from news and information to generalization, supposition, speculation, and so on. So I want to talk to you about a few stories that I found in our leading news organizations, the New York Times and the Washington Post, just to kind of give you a little idea of what the tricks of the trade are. So you can be aware of these when you see these stories. Will Harris's lead last? A few questions that will shape the answer. So how do you make a story like this? Does anybody know will Harris's lead last? Does anybody know? No. There's no way, especially when this ran in August. So a few questions that will shape the answer. What were the questions? Well, actually, there were only two in the article. The first one was, is this just a bounce? It was the post-convention bounce, which historically happens, and it happened again with Kamala Harris. So this writer posed the question and then answered it, saying, basically, maybe. I'm not kidding, because nobody knows, right? The second question was, can Trump redefine her? Which is, interesting question, legitimate question. Does anybody know? No. But this writer went through a list of ways that Trump is attempting to redefine Kamala Harris. And basically, the resolution of that little quest was maybe. And then finally, the writer concluded with this. If Ms. Harris's position mostly holds, I remember the word if Ms. Harris's position mostly holds after the spotlight fades, the next question is whether her support will be resilient enough to withstand the difficulties ahead. And of course, the answer is maybe. In other words, what I just wrote and what you just read might happen and it might not happen. And there's so much of that. So let's talk about another one. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're good. Harris-Trump housing ideas. Economists have doubts. This is what one of the first articles said. There are two visions of how to solve America's affordable housing shortages have little in common, and Ms. Harris's plan is far more detailed, but they do share one quality. Both have drawn skepticism from outside economists. So take a guess. How many outside economists were quoted in this story? 3, 1, 2, 4. Which, for the New York Times, there's New York Times level of reporting, and then there's, I lived and worked there, so commercial appeal level of reporting. Commercial appeal might require 2. New York Times is going to require at least 4. Now, if you've studied economics at all, or if you've read much about economics, you are familiar with these two quotations. This one is from George Bernard Shaw. If all economists were laid end to end, they'd never reach a conclusion. And then Harry Truman said, give me a one-handed economist. This is so he or she can't say, on the other hand. So the fact that economists have doubts is like saying, dog bites man. You could have talked to 400 economists, 4,000 economists, and they would all have some kind of doubt about Harris's plan and Trump's plan. But 4 economists doesn't make for a conclusion. You can't draw a conclusion from 4 economists. So why do they do this sort of thing? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. There was another story after this that was actually, I thought, more about the news and information. It basically was explaining Harris's plans for the economy and Trump's plans for the economy, as much as we know about them. And that's all it was. It just explained. And that's the kind of information we need. What is it that Harris wants to do about our economy? How does she want to manage the economy? And how does Trump want to manage it or not manage it? Next one. Now, these kinds of stories just drive me insane. In North Carolina, some black voters uneasy with Harris's abortion rights focus. North Carolina, 10 million people, 12 million people, 30, 40% African American. Some black voters are uncomfortable with this, so how many do you think they talked to? Now, we don't know exactly how many they talked to, but they quoted 4. So this word some, this is a standard device used by journalists, the word some. If you have talked to at least 2 people, you can say some. If you've only talked to 1, you really can't say some. So there is a threshold, but it's not very high. It's 2. But the New York Times has a higher threshold, thank God, only 4. So 4 African-American voters, they found 4 African-American voters who were uneasy with Harris's abortion rights focus. And those are the people they quoted. Now, it's very possible, well, it's unlikely, but I guess it's possible that there are only 4 black voters in North Carolina who are uneasy with her position on abortion. Probably more, but how many? Nobody knows. And there were several stories like this within weeks of each other. Another one was some black voters say they wonder if a black woman can win. How many? 3. And this was across the nation. Some black voters are souring on Democrats. How many? 1. They quoted 1. Now, in journalism world, it is important for you to try to find real human beings to talk to. But what ends up happening is that if you find 2 or 3, and you may talk to 20 or 30, but if you find the right 2 or 3 who will confirm your supposition, then that's what you do. So I don't know how many folks this reporter talked to, maybe 40, maybe 400. But he or she found 4 who would confirm the supposition that some black voters were uneasy with this. And that happens all the time. We generalize the act. Generalization, according to dictionaries, the act of passing from statistical sample data to generalizations, usually with calculated degrees of certainty, to form a notion from scanty evidence. And that is exactly what's happening. These kinds of stories are developed from scanty evidence. I'll give you this is like hitting the daily double on these kinds of stories. Many Gen Z men felt left behind. Some see Trump as an answer. So when you have the many and some combo, not only does it sound even more impressive and smarter, but it means even less. In interviews, many of the young men, now listen to this. This is how they worded this. In interviews, plural, many of the young men supporting Mr. Trump said they admired his strength and macho demeanor. In interviews with young men planning to vote for Mr. Trump, young men planning to vote for Mr. Trump, and we all know what the voter turnout is for young men, they described feeling unvalued. How many interviews? Anybody? We don't really know how many people they talked to, but they quoted 5 across the nation. 5 young men they found who said they were going to vote for Mr. Trump, or they would plan to vote for Mr. Trump, and they felt unvalued. That's just not good journalism. It is sort of interesting. It's always interesting to talk to regular folks about their thoughts and feelings because they matter. You can find the universal in the particular. You can find one voter whose thoughts and feelings and ideas and experiences kind of sum up a larger group of folks, right? But you can't make it seem, you can't extrapolate, you can't make it seem like these 5 people you found to talk to, that they might be the only 5. How do we know? There's one more. Second apparent assassination attempt on Trump props alarm abroad. According to this article, there is widespread concern that the November election will not end well and that American democracy is frayed to the breaking point. Another line said France was stunned. Another line said the world is anxious. I don't know about you, but it would take me quite a while to talk to everybody in the world. And by then, we'd all be anxious. The question now, according to this, is how violent will this political confrontation in America prove? For many around the world, there's that word, it seems to contain the seeds of rampant conflict. How many folks from around the world were quoted in this one article? 7, which is more than normal. It's a pretty good number, because you're not just talking about the country, you're talking about the world, so you got to do more than 4. But 7 out of 7 billion. And as far as I know, they didn't talk to anybody in Asia, which there's quite a few folks there. So he talked to a British MP. He didn't talk to the president of Mexico. He used one of the tweets from the president of Mexico. A French history professor, an Italian lawmaker, a German online editor, a Nicaraguan professor, and a South African economist. So these 7 people have determined that the world is anxious, that there is alarm abroad. Now, there may very well be alarm abroad. I wouldn't be surprised. But how alarmed is the world? How anxious is the world? Nobody knows. You can't say. You can't possibly say. So why do you try to make it seem like the views of 7 people sort of summarize the views of 7 billion people? There's a guy who works at NYU named Jay Rosen. He's a longtime media observer and critic, very well known, very well respected. And he said, generally the problem with the news media is that they are covering the odds and not the stakes of an election. We cover the horse race. Well, let me quote him. He said, "It is an easy way, when you cover the odds and not the stakes, it is an easy way to make a complicated subject come alive for audiences. It creates excitement of a kind, suspense. I don't mean to say that news of the horse race is some sort of sin or poison that has got to be driven from the news. Rather, that the horse race should not be the model for how you design your coverage. It should not be the organizing principle of your campaign coverage. And yet it tends to be, because it is easier to do, and it is easier to make it sound interesting and exciting and suspenseful. And it's a lot more fun to write. I've done it, I know. It really is fun to write. Another media critic named Will Bunch, who writes for the Philadelphia Inquirer, a longtime journalist, said, our profession's weird value structure, he says this is why we do this. He says it's because of our profession's weird value structure, where it's more important to be savvy, cynical, and not portrayed as naive shills for liberalism or conservatism than to care about saving democracy from authoritarian rule. So if you noticed all these examples, all 7 of these, it wasn't just that they were trying to extrapolate and generalize. They were, every headline had a negative slant. There's a problem here. There could be a problem here. There might be a problem here. Might be a problem for Harris, might be a problem for Trump, might be a problem for democracy. A recent study of more than 23 million headlines from 47 U.S. news outlets showed that the, quote, proportion of headlines denoting anger, fear, disgust, and sadness have grown markedly over the past 2 decades. When you add digital technology, social media, the World Wide Web, nonstop news, and human nature to the equation, we have become a generation of doom scrollers. We do this all day, and all we see is doom and gloom. Why do we all tend to pay more attention? I mean, they're not doing this because they're mean and cruel. They're doing this because people click. So why do we all tend to pay more attention to and remember negative news reports? Social scientists call it negativity bias, the tendency to allow negative experiences and information to overwhelm the good. It afflicts all of us, the general population and the news media. Are things worse than ever, or are we just more aware of things than ever, or is our greater awareness making things worse? It's hard to say. But I do think it's a problem. And I think it's a problem because even the greatest news organizations in the world, and thank God they're there, they are vital to everybody. The reporting they do generally, the journalism they do matters, and we need it. But when you start pulling stuff like this, especially during a very important campaign season, that becomes a problem because, number one, it doesn't really describe reality, even though it purports to. Number two, it describes a false and distorted and negatively slanted reality. And number three, it presents generalization and speculation as news and information. And it's the message we are taking in all the time, directly and subliminally, which I think the message is things are bad and they're getting worse. And there's no hope, and we all should be very afraid. And I don't know about you, but every conversation I have about the election ends up going there. Things are bad and getting worse, and there's no hope. It's what Michelle Obama called that sense of dread she felt in the pit of her stomach. There's a rabbi named Sharon Brous in L.A. She's brilliant. I highly recommend all of her sermons. They're all online. She did a sermon she's done several about Israel and Gaza. And she's remarkably prophetic and balanced. But she talked in one of those sermons about moral panic. And I think the problem with this kind of coverage and coverage generally and just the way things are going in politics, it creates this sense of desperation and fear and dread, which leads to a form of moral panic. Now, not as bad as Gaza and Israel, obviously, but this is what Rabbi Brous said about moral panic. Moral panic follows a dangerous trajectory from legitimate concern to exaggeration and distortion of a threat, to increased hostility toward those perceived to be fueling the threat, to thoughtless consensus and entrenchment in an increasingly misrepresented reality, to acts of violence. According to scholars, moral panics gather converts by playing on people's worst fears. I've always thought that elections, especially presidential elections in this country, are about two things, hope and fear. And I used to think that one result was hopeful and one result was fearful, but I really think that it's both. I think every election is about both. The winners always say, well, they feel more hopeful now, and the losers always say they feel more fearful now, no matter which way it goes. And I think this kind of news coverage, and this is a small percentage of the kind of coverage we usually get from the Times and the Post and other legitimate organizations. Cable news is so much worse. So anyway, I want to end with, that's Rabbi Brous, and that's her newest book. I highly recommend it, The Amen Effect. It's beautiful, it's brilliant, it's encouraging, it's hopeful, and it's helpful. Going back to Parker Palmer, a Quaker, very thoughtful guy, beautiful writer. This is what he said in this book. Within us all is a yearning for something better than divisiveness, toxicity, passivity, powerlessness, and selling our democratic inheritance to the highest bidder. Rightly understood, politics is no game at all. It is the ancient and honorable human endeavor of creating a community in which the weak as well as the strong can flourish, love and power can collaborate, and justice and mercy can have their day. One more. Parker Palmer says, citizenship is a way of being in the world rooted in the knowledge that I am a member of a vast community of human and non-human beings that I depend on for essentials that I could never provide for myself. As a journalist, as a member of the Free Press, as a member of the Fourth Estate, the news media, I think it is our responsibility to enhance that kind of citizenship, to inform, not to inflame, to enhance, not to distort, to enable and not paralyze. What can we do about it? Well, we can start by expecting better journalism, demanding better journalism, choosing better journalism. And you choose every day when you click. Don't take the bait. Think twice about reading stories that have headlines with the word some or many or both. Don't click on stories because they make you feel afraid. That doesn't mean we don't need to be informed about things that we should be afraid of. We should. But there's a huge difference between news. When there's a school shooting, that's news. We want to know what happened and why. And extrapolation and supposition and commentary about weapons or guns or whatever, and what some people think and what many people think. So you have to be more discerning. We all have to be more discerning about what we choose to click on. Because once you click, your vote is registered. And it's fed into the computers of the greatest news organizations in the world, and they say, that's what they want. Well, that's what we'll give them. Now, I said, when I was here last time, the ultimate form of voting for or against news media is not to watch cable TV news. And I still believe that. I actually didn't watch the debate. I wanted to, because I wanted to see one candidate, but I didn't want to see the other candidate. But debates are artificial too, right? And they tend more often than not to, instead of inform, they tend to anger or disappoint or discourage or whatever. You want to throw things at the TV, or you want to leave the room. Are you more informed? Probably not. So I think it's all incumbent upon us as consumers, as citizens, as journalists, to be more discerning about what we do and what we read and what we listen to and how we talk about it. I think it's important to resist our negativity bias. When we were in the caves, cavemen and women, it served us well, because if we heard a sound, we immediately thought it might be something that would endanger us, and we reacted. We don't have to do that now. We do it a little bit, but not much. Embrace the positive. When you see a positive story or something that seems like it's a positive take on something, click on it. Even if you just read the first paragraph or two, you're voting for something that isn't negativity bias. And you're also rewarding the journalist and the organization that decided to make that a news story, to write something that was more positive. Because, we've said forever, well, people say they want good news stories, but they never pay for them. They don't click on them. They don't really want them. Show them that that's not true. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is keeping hope alive, right? Which is why we're all here on this Sunday and why we keep coming back. So thank you all for being here. And how about that? 10 o'clock. I'm happy to answer questions if you have time.
This one is on. So I'll start by saying thank you for pulling back the curtain a bit and showing us what's happening behind the screen, as it were, and as always, insightful and helpful. Questions from, yeah.
I just want to say thank you very much. I think we all experienced a lot of this. Yeah. Here's my question. Anybody who's studied methodology of human data and so on know that a poll like that depends on the quality, the validity of it depends on how much that 1,000-person sphere represents right. the population that they are claiming it does. And has anybody looked into it? Every news story you start to hear, they give the polls, the latest polls, and those companies are going out polling. Yeah. Has anybody really looked at the validity of the representativeness of right. the 1,000 people who responded yeah, of our actual community? How much right. they represent the actual community?
Yes, that they look at that all the time, and the reputable news organizations work with universities or other legitimate polling organizations to do valid polls. So if they question 1,000 people, they want a representative sampling of Michigan voters or potential Michigan voters or whatever. So in some cases, because the world has changed so much and we don't have landlines and we don't answer phones all the time, to get a representative sample of 1,000 people, you might have to call 300,000 people. And they do that. Now, my next question is, so you have to be discerning about how they do their poll. The second part is, what kind of questions are they asking? Now, most news organizations that are legitimate will have a link to their actual poll, so you can see the actual questions they asked and the responses they got. So I think that's really important. How did they phrase the questions? Did they phrase them in a negative way, a positive way, a neutral way? That's really important, as you know. The third thing is, and I think the way I look at polls is it is a snapshot in time. So the question is not whether it's necessarily a valid snapshot, it's what do you do with that information? How do you report it? How do you process it? What does it mean? And my wife is a 30-plus year teacher, elementary school teacher, and she has been immersed in testing for a long time, and it's getting worse and worse. So testing is really important. Testing kids is really important for teachers and for parents and for kids, because that information can help you determine how to help that child do better. And it's very particular and it's very individualized. And if you know how to test properly and you know what the results mean that will help you be a better teacher or a better parent, that's vital information. But what we have done is politicize it. So it really doesn't mean anything. So the schools with the higher test scores are supposed to be the better schools. Well, that's not even close to true. Testing really tests parents and income level more than it tests a child's ability or a teacher's ability, for sure. So it's not that testing or polling isn't important and doesn't matter. It does, but it's how you use it. And when you use it to try to extrapolate and say, well, a poll said that young men age 18 to 30 are more likely to vote for Trump than for Kamala Harris, then we're going to go out and find 3 or 4 young men who say they're going to vote for Trump, ask them why, and we're going to present that as some kind of worthy conclusion. Well, what 3 or 4 people are you quoting? Did you, in the course of your work, did you happen to find 3 or 4 people who said they weren't voting for Trump? What do you do with that information? If you talk to 20 people and only 3 said they were voting, what do you do with that information? So it gets really complicated. And like the guy said, it's much simpler to not get into that kind of, because your eyes are going to glaze over and you're not going to read it. So I think it's important to keep all of that in context. Polls are legitimate, but what do you use them for? How do you present them? They're helpful for candidates. They're helpful for people who are doing voter registration drives. They're helpful in many ways, but are they helpful in presenting this as how the American population thinks? I don't think so.
My question is the writer doing what the editor wants them to do, or is the writer doing it because of the deadlines?
It's a combination of all those things. Some of it's about how much time you have to get the story done. Some of it's about your ability, whether you're a good reporter or not such a good reporter, about your own willingness to go out and talk to strangers and how many people you want to talk to. If you're ever reading a story, and it doesn't matter where it is, if there are not at least 3 sources in that story, and I don't care how short it is, if there are not at least 3 different sources in that story, I would ignore it. I've seen stories lately in our local organizations that have had one source for the entire story. And you might as well just give that source your pen and your laptop and let them write it, right? So a lot of it is what we internalize. How do we get on the front page? How do we get our stories published? How do we get our stories noticed, not just by readers, but by editors? And when you write a story like this, you sound really smart. You really do. You sound like you know what you're talking about. You have this insight that other normal human beings don't have because you're out there and you're talking to people. So I think it's a combination of trying to do good work with scanty evidence because of time, because of everything else, and also trying to impress editors and trying to get your work noticed and so on.
You mentioned the negativity of news. We all complain about the negativity of news. I attended a lecture that the late Harry Reasoner made at the Jewish Community Center about 20 years ago. And somebody asked him, and he said, do you have a partner, a spouse? Yeah. When you go home at night, do you say to your partner or spouse, I did not have a flat tire today?
I know, yeah.
And he said, in a way, he said, news is inherently negative.
Yeah.
I've said to my wife many times, I wish I could turn on the 10 o'clock news at night and the LP reported no one was shot in Fraser tonight.
Yeah.
I grew up in Fraser, and I'm very sensitive about that. But
Yeah.
That's not news. That's not what we watch.
Right.
And
Absolutely
care to comment
right.
on that?
Absolutely right. News by nature is negative. When something bad happens, you want to tell somebody. And not just like individually, but collectively. So yes, that's true. My issue is not with the presentation of news so much as the extrapolation of news that we do to make ourselves sound smarter and more informed, and also the negativity bias that we inject into the news. So the news by nature is negative, but that doesn't mean that our explanation of it is necessarily has to be negative.
Okay, my question is, like many of you, I'm barraged with polling requests online. I don't answer the phone, but are we doing, and I'll respond to none of them, so nobody has my vote, predicted vote. Is that a disservice? And if we need to let our voice be known, what is a good polling source if we want?
That's a good question.
Is that?
Yeah, I would not respond to texts just because there are so many scammers out there. And one, scam text is all it takes to, empty your bank account. Answering your phone is a different, if you're in the middle of a campaign season and you see a number you don't recognize, you can roll the dice and hope it's not a scammer, and you'll know right away. Because if they don't ask you for your bank number or any kind of money, then they're legit, right? So I would probably tend to try to answer the phone if I don't recognize, especially this time of year, because I think you're right. I think those of us who are particularly skeptical of such efforts our voices are not included, our views are not included. But I do think that as she said, I do think that legitimate pollsters make every effort to have a representative sample, no matter how many calls they got to make or no matter how many texts they got to send, hundreds of thousands. So I think you individually are not skewing the results by not, if it's a legitimate poll. Yeah.
You mentioned the blending of fear and hope in reading a lot of this material, and we all carry a heavy burden of existential angst, I think.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how we can lessen that angst, particularly by staying away from cable news and things like this. But also, you mentioned 2 books, The Amen Effect and The Healing. It seemed to me reading a study book would be better. Do you have any other
Yes.
suggested books like that?
Well, the Gospels are pretty good. Seriously. I'll think about that. There's so many really thoughtful books written by people of faith and just regular folks. I'll send Catherine a list of some that I would recommend. But really, to me, the Bible, the Gospels, they're about fear. Fear not. Is that like the most common expression in the Bible? Fear not. But it's not fear, it's fear not. And there's also a whole lot of grief, but there's also a whole lot of hope. So I think we have to try to be as balanced as we can. When we're feeling dread, when we're feeling hopeless, when we're feeling discouraged and distraught, we have to intentionally find ways not to. And I think books like this really help, especially the Amen Effect. When you encounter a person of faith, a religious person who has this depth of faith, almost a mystical depth of faith, Catherine knows many of those folks. They remind, I love the word remind because it's like reminding you. It's putting your mind back in sort of a more equilibrium place to remind you that there is good and there is hope. And ultimately, as people of faith, we might not be optimistic, but we're hopeful, right? So I think it's important for all of us to find ways, individually, collectively, in church, at home, whatever, to remind each other through books, through study, through just telling stories about good things that happen, as much as you can to balance that.
Yeah, I when I'm reading the paper, I often will read some of the articles like you described and think, I think this belongs in the opinion section. Like the blur between news and opinion, it seems like the newspaper should be 90% opinion section and 10% news. I don't know. Do you ever think about things that, like, where the line is between?
Yeah, well, when I started working for a newspaper in 1980, a long time ago, they were adamant. The editors were adamant about labeling, if it wasn't news, if there was any sort of, not just necessarily commentary opinion, but even an attempt at analysis of the news, it was labeled as such. Analysis, commentary, that has slowly faded for many, many reasons. And now you, as I said, you have to be your own editor in some ways. You have to discern for yourself, is this analysis? Is this informed analysis? Is this fair and balanced analysis? Is this commentary? Is it some kind of mix? When I teach students at the University of Memphis, one of the things I have to sort of teach out of them is their need to put their own opinion in the story. And I don't know if that's because they've grown up watching TV news all the time, where TV news reporters often put a little postscript on their story, which basically amounts to a feeling they have, which is fine. But I think we have to. Yes, you have to be careful because the line is almost gone. It's definitely gone in TV for the most part, and it's becoming blurrier and blurrier with stories like this. It's a shame. But, if you know that, you're an informed consumer, and that helps.
We know a lot more.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all
for this
being here.
time. Thanks, y'all. Rumor has it we'll be reading the Gospels right over there at 10:30, and come back next week for Chanel Baker, who'll be, again, continuing this really thoughtful, we're so lucky to have these thoughtful folks who are friends of Calvary to come and guide us through this